The island where everyone vanished. Easter Island Collapse. Chapter 1, A Whisper in the Pacific. If you're looking for a place that feels like it's been dropped straight from the sky onto the ocean, Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is your spot. Tiny, remote, and about as easy to miss as your car keys under the couch, this island sits alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Like, really alone. Imagine sailing for days and days with nothing but water in sight, and there's land. And not just any land. A land with giant stone heads staring at you like they know your secrets. Yeah, Easter Island is famous for its Moai statues, the massive stone figures that have been staring silently across the island for hundreds of years. Some are so big that if one sneezed, it might flatten a small car. They're lined up, some on platforms called "Ooh," all gazing inland, as if keeping a watch over the island's secrets. People often think, wow, who built these and why? And trust me, the questions don't stop there. Now picture this. You're standing on a cliff, wind whipping your hair in every possible direction, looking at the Moai. You can almost hear the ocean whispering. We saw everything. We remember. And it's true. The ocean has seen everything. But the island. The island has its own stories, quietly buried in the soil, in the fallen stones, in the strange silence between the waves. Rapa Nui is tiny, like 63 square miles tiny. To put that in perspective, it's smaller than many cities you've driven through without even thinking about it. But back in the day, it wasn't just empty land with statues. It was home to a society that built, farmed, fished, and somehow managed to move giant stone heads without cranes or trucks. That's the part that makes your jaw drop. So, how did a society that could move these gigantic stone heads vanish? That's the whisper we're chasing. But before we get too spooky about lost civilizations and mysterious disappearances, let's slow down. Because Rapa Nui is more than just mystery. It's a place of imagination, ingenuity, and, yeah, some good old-fashioned human stubbornness. The island is volcanic, made from 3 big volcanoes that form a triangle. There's a crater here, a lava field there, and fertile soil in spots that actually allowed people to farm. And farm they did. Sweet potatoes, yams, taro, you name it. Imagine growing all your food on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, with the weather sometimes acting like it's auditioning for a disaster movie. But the people of Rapa Nui made it work. They were survivors, thinkers, and apparently expert statue movers. Here's the thing about Moai. They're not just random heads. Most of them have torsos, though many are buried up to their necks. Some stand up to 33 feet tall and weigh over 80 tons. Yeah, 80 tons. That's like trying to move 10 elephants stacked on top of each other without a single motorized vehicle. And yet, somehow they did it. Scholars debate exactly how. Some say they walked the statues upright with ropes. Others think they used log rollers or sleds. Honestly, watching a Moai walk across the island is probably the only time in history when saying it moved itself might actually make sense. The people of Rapa Nui, known as the Rapa Nui, arrived on the island somewhere around the 12th century. That's right, they sailed thousands of miles across the Pacific in canoes, with no GPS, no Google Maps, not even a good old-fashioned compass. Just stars, waves, and a very strong sense of adventure. And they stayed, thriving in a place so isolated that even pigeons would have a hard time finding it. Life on Rapa Nui wasn't easy, but it was creative. They built houses from volcanic rock, cultivated crops in tricky soils, and developed a unique script called Rongorongo, though no one alive today can fully read it. Imagine having a diary written in a secret code nobody can crack. Makes you wonder what kind of notes they were keeping. Grocery lists? Love poems? Instructions on moving 80-ton statues without losing your mind? Probably all of the above. Now, for a little humor before things get heavy. Picture this, a group of Rapa Nui people trying to explain to future archaeologists how they moved the statues. One says, "We tied ropes." Another says, "No, we rocked them like a baby." And maybe a third just shrugs and says, "Honestly, magic." And honestly, we can't completely rule out magic. At least, in the storybook version of history, it's way more fun. But even with all the ingenuity, there's a sense of tension on the island. Because as isolated as Rapa Nui was, it couldn't escape the laws of nature. Resources are limited on any small island, and over time, that becomes a big problem. But that's a story for later chapters. For now, let's just enjoy the calm the mysterious hum of the Pacific, and the silent guardians staring at us with their stone eyes. Tourists now flock to the island in the thousands every year, snapping photos of Moai, hiking volcanic craters, and whispering the word mystery like it's an ingredient in the air. But imagine what it was like back when only the Rapa Nui walked there. No roads, no airports, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of the ocean, the wind, and maybe the distant pounding of stone as statues were carved. The island must have felt enormous, yet intimate, a tiny world of its own with secrets buried under every stone. And let's not forget the birds. The island was home to seabirds in massive colonies, and for the Rapa Nui, birds weren't just pets, they were part of life, food, and culture. They even had a birdman cult later on, where leaders competed in dangerous challenges involving cliffs and ocean swims to collect sacred bird eggs. Talk about extreme sports, Rapa Nui style. So standing here in our imagination, we're at the edge of one of the strangest, most enchanting islands on the planet. Giant heads watching us, the ocean stretching endlessly, volcanic hills rising like sleeping giants. The Rapa Nui were small, clever humans who made a mark so massive it still has archaeologists scratching their heads centuries later. And that's the whisper in the Pacific, the soft, quiet voice of an island that once hummed with life, ambition, and mystery. It's a whisper that asks, how did this thriving society vanish? Where did they go? What did they leave behind? And while we can't answer all those questions just yet, we can start to hear them, faintly, in the wind, in the waves, and in the silence between the statues. By the end of this chapter, you should be feeling two things. One, because let's face it, moving an 80-ton rock is impressive no matter how you slice it. And two, curiosity, because the story of Easter Island isn't just about rocks. It's about people, survival, ambition, and yes, a little bit of mystery sprinkled on top. So take a deep breath. Imagine the salty Pacific wind, the sun beating down, and the soft shuffle of feet on volcanic rock. Imagine standing in front of a Moai for the first time, feeling its silent gaze. And remember this, every whisper in the Pacific has a story behind it. Some are loud, some are quiet, and some, well, they wait for centuries before anyone notices. Easter Island is whispering now. And lucky for us, we're listening. The arrival of the first settlers. Before the Moai stared silently across Easter Island, before the forest shrank and the fields became tricky to farm, there were the first humans. Brave, adventurous, slightly crazy humans. Because getting to Easter Island wasn't a walk in the park. It was a canoe trip across thousands of miles of open ocean. No GPS, no Google Maps, not even a tiny paper map that wouldn't get soggy. Just stars, waves, birds, and got so big you could use them as life rafts. The Polynesians were some of the best navigators in history. Seriously. They crossed oceans that would make most of us break into a cold sweat just thinking about swimming across a pool. They used the stars to guide them, watched the waves, tracked the flight of birds, and read clouds and currents like secret codes. Basically, they were the ultimate ocean hackers. And somehow, sometime around the 12th century, they spotted that tiny green speck in the middle of the Pacific and said, yep, that looks like home. Now imagine you're on a canoe. The ocean stretches endlessly in every direction. The sun is beating down. The waves are bigger than your neighbor's dog. And you're thinking, is that a wave? Is that a rock? Or is it a giant fish plotting against me? And then suddenly land. It must have felt like seeing an oasis after walking through a desert, or like finally finding Wi-Fi in the middle of nowhere. When the first settlers landed, Easter Island was nothing like it is today. It was a paradise. Lush forests, birds everywhere, fresh water streams, and plenty of fertile soil. If you were there, you'd probably be tempted to lie down in the grass, stare at the sky, and whisper, "This is way too good to be true." The island had giant palm trees, thick forests, and a coastline teeming with fish. Food was everywhere. Sweet potatoes, yams, bananas, and taro grew naturally. And let's not forget the seafood, fish, shellfish, maybe the occasional crab that looked like it could pinch your nose off. Life on Easter Island started off like a free buffet in the middle of the Pacific. The first settlers didn't just chill in hammocks all day, though that would have been fun. They had work to do. First, they needed to make homes, which mostly meant digging into the volcanic soil, building small stone houses, and figuring out how to farm in a new land. And yes, they had to learn which plants were safe to eat. Eating the wrong root could be the fastest trip off the island possible. So they experimented, observed, and adapted. Over time, they turned the island into a place that could actually support a thriving society. But getting there was only half the challenge. Once on the island, they had to survive. And survival wasn't always easy. The island is small, isolated, and full of nature's curveballs. Storms could roll in out of nowhere, ocean waves could capsize a canoe, and food shortages could sneak up if crops failed. But the early settlers were tough. They were smart. They worked together. And they had courage that, honestly, would make most of us go, "Nope, I'll stay home and watch TV instead." Speaking of courage, think about this. These voyagers weren't just floating around aimlessly. They had a plan, or at least a hope. They believed they could make a new life on a speck of land that nobody had ever seen. That takes confidence. That takes bravery. And maybe a little bit of crazy. You don't just decide one morning, "Hey, let's cross 2,000 miles of open water and hope we find an island." But they did it anyway. Once the settlers arrived, they began exploring every inch of the island. Climbing hills, checking caves, testing streams, looking at birds, and probably wondering, okay, what's edible? What's dangerous? And how do we move these giant rocks around? Their first impressions must have been like a mix of awe and, honestly, some, "No, this is going to be a lot of work" moments. Because even though it was paradise, paradise doesn't build itself. Life started simple. Fishing, hunting birds, collecting fruit, and farming small plots. They also brought animals with them, mostly chickens and rats. Yep, the tiny sneaky rats came along for the ride, probably thinking, best cruise ever. Free food everywhere. And while chickens were a helpful source of eggs and meat, the rats would later become a serious headache for the island. But we'll get to that. For now, it was all about discovery, growth, and learning the rhythms of the island. One of the most fascinating parts of this early period was how the settlers started shaping the land. Not in a destructive way at first, but in a creative way. They cleared patches for farming, planted crops in clever patterns, and slowly molded the island to suit their needs. They also started carving the first Moai, though not the giant 80-ton versions yet. Think smaller, experimental statues, like they were practicing before going full giant mode. It's kind of like a kid making tiny clay models before sculpting a massive statue for the school fair. There's also something beautiful about how isolated the settlers were. They didn't have neighbors. They didn't have trade partners nearby. No one was going to drop by with pizza or mail a box of supplies. Everything they had, they brought with them or made themselves. That kind of self-reliance forced creativity, problem-solving, and a strong sense of community. Everyone had a role, everyone contributed, and slowly, the foundations of society were laid. And yet, for all their skill and cleverness, there was something mysterious about the island that the settlers couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the wind whistling through the cliffs, or the strange rock formations, or the occasional eerie shadow cast by the rising moon on the hills. Whatever it was, they must have felt it, a kind of quiet magic, like the island was alive and watching them, whispering, "I've been here long before you. Tread carefully." And honestly, it was probably wise advice. At first, life was good. Resources were plentiful. The forests were full, the fish were plenty, and the land could feed them. They had room to grow, explore, and experiment. It must have felt like starting over in the best possible way, like pressing a reset button on life, only in paradise. And while there would eventually be struggles, conflicts, environmental challenges, and the weight of moving giant statues, those were problems for the future. For now, the first settlers were writing the first chapter of human life on Easter Island, full of hope, courage, and maybe just a tiny bit of wonder. So picture this, canoes arriving on the shore, explorers stepping onto soft sand, birds fluttering in the palm trees, water sparkling in the sun, families exploring, planting, building. And above all, a sense of awe because they were here on an island that seemed impossibly far away, ready to make it home. And maybe, just maybe, they paused to wonder, what will we leave behind? Because every story, even one that starts in paradise, has twists, turns, and lessons. And Easter Island's story is just beginning. Building a society. Once the first settlers arrived on Easter Island, life wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living, building, and figuring out how humans could exist in harmony with an island that was both generous and fragile. And believe me, that's no small task. At first, people probably just did whatever felt natural. Families would hunt, fish, gather fruits, and plant crops where the soil seemed good. But over time, patterns emerged. Certain families became leaders. Others became skilled farmers or fishermen. And slowly, the island's population organized itself into clans. A clan was basically a big family group, but not just your cousins you see at every awkward holiday dinner. Clans were groups connected by blood, marriage, and sometimes alliances with other clans. Each clan had its own territory on the island, usually marked by natural landmarks or stone structures. And each clan had its chief, someone who made decisions, led rituals, and occasionally reminded everyone not to dig up the neighbor's garden. The chiefs were important, but their power wasn't like a modern-day king issuing decrees from a throne. They were leaders who earned respect through wisdom, bravery, and skill. They helped settle disputes, organized work, and led the clan in religious ceremonies. And speaking of religion, spirituality was a huge part of life on Rapa Nui. The Rapa Nui believed in a world filled with powerful spirits, both in the land and in the sea. The Moai statues weren't just art. They were believed to hold the mana or spiritual power of ancestors. The statues watched over the living, offering protection, guidance, and maybe the occasional judgmental stare. People would make offerings, perform ceremonies, and hold rituals to honor these spirits. Imagine trying to explain to a friend that your neighbor's giant stone head might be judging your gardening skills. But for the Rapa Nui, it was serious business, and it helped hold society together. As the society grew, so did the need for food. This led to the rise of agriculture. Sweet potatoes became a staple. They were hearty, nutritious, and surprisingly versatile. Alongside them, people cultivated yams, taro, and bananas. Farming wasn't just about planting seeds and hoping for rain. The Rapa Nui developed clever techniques to deal with the island's volcanic soil, using stone walls to protect crops from wind and soil erosion. You could say they were basically the original landscaping engineers. Chickens were also a big deal. They provided eggs and meat, and they were easy to raise. But here's a fun little fact. The Rapa Nui didn't just raise chickens for food. Sometimes chickens were part of rituals or even gifts to other clans. Basically, if you were short on gold or jewelry, a well-fed chicken could earn you a lot of respect. And let's not forget the ocean. Fishing was a major source of protein. The Rapa Nui knew the waters around the island like the back of their hand. They caught fish, shellfish, and sometimes even lobsters. And while the ocean could be dangerous, it was also generous. Harmony with nature was crucial in these early centuries. The settlers understood that the island was small, resources were limited, and overuse could lead to disaster. They fished responsibly, rotated crops, and respected forests. In many ways, the early Rapa Nui society was an example of balance, humans and nature coexisting. If only modern society could take notes. Clans would also collaborate. Even though each had its own chief, they shared knowledge, traded resources, and sometimes helped with large projects. One of the earliest and most impressive projects was the construction of platforms called ahu. These stone platforms were the base for Moai statues. Building an ahu was no small task. Stones had to be quarried, transported, and assembled with precision. It required teamwork, planning, and probably a lot of sore muscles. And let's be honest, moving massive stones isn't exactly a casual weekend hobby. But for the Rapa Nui, it was a statement. It was a way to honor ancestors, show clan strength, and maybe even impress the neighboring clan with a look what we built kind of flex. These projects reinforced social bonds, gave people a sense of purpose, and helped organize labor in ways that kept the society functional. Even daily life had structure. People had roles. Some were farmers, some were fishermen, some were carvers or builders. Children learned skills from their parents and elders, passing down knowledge from generation to generation. And through all of this, the Moai stood as silent witnesses, reminding everyone of the ancestors' power and the importance of cooperation. There's a funny thing about building society on a remote island. You quickly learn that cooperation isn't optional. If your clan didn't work together, you'd run out of food, or the crops would fail, or someone might accidentally knock over a Moai. And while we like to joke about it, this need for cooperation actually shaped the culture, creating a sense of respect, responsibility, and interdependence. Religion, leadership, agriculture, and teamwork all work together like gears in a clock. They helped society function smoothly, allowed populations to grow, and created a world where humans and nature could coexist. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Challenges were always around the corner. Storms could destroy crops, disease could strike, and disagreements between clans could flare up. But for a long while, the balance held. In those early centuries, Easter Island must have felt alive, vibrant, and full of potential. Imagine walking through lush forests, hearing birds overhead, seeing children play near streams, adults tending fields, chiefs organizing ceremonies, and sculptors carving their first moai. It was a society that worked, a society that thrived, and a society that respected the land that supported it. So, as we look back, it's easy to imagine the island as a paradise. Not a perfect paradise. Nature always has its challenges, but a place where humans could live, grow, and dream. The Rapa Nui created homes, cultivated land, worshipped ancestors, and slowly transformed a remote volcanic island into a thriving society. And all of this set the stage for the next big chapter, the era of the giant statues, where ambition, art, and human ingenuity would reach epic proportions. But in this chapter, it's enough to pause and appreciate the foundations, clans, chiefs, rituals, farms, and the quiet harmony with nature. It's a reminder that building society is never about a single hero or a single invention. It's about cooperation, learning, and sometimes laughing at the absurdity of life, like trying to farm on a tiny windy island while a moai silently judges your technique. Early Easter Island society was simple in some ways, brilliant in others, and above all, adaptable. And that adaptability, combined with courage and ingenuity, would shape the destiny of the island for centuries to come. The Moai, silent watchers. If there's one thing that makes Easter Island unforgettable, it's the Moai. These colossal stone heads, and yes, most of them have bodies buried beneath the soil, stand like silent guardians across the island. They are big, imposing, and somehow manage to look both serious and slightly judgmental at the same time. Seriously, stand in front of one, and you might feel like it knows all the secrets you've ever tried to hide. The origins of these giant statues are as fascinating as they are mysterious. The earliest moai were carved around the 13th century, hundreds of years after the first Polynesian settlers arrived. But why build them? Why go through the insane effort of carving massive stone figures, moving them across the island, and setting them up on stone platforms called ahu? The answer lies in the Rapa Nui belief system. The moai weren't just statues. They were spiritual beings, believed to hold the mana, or life force, of the ancestors. Each moai represented a deceased leader or important person from the clan. By carving their likeness and placing them on an ahu facing the villages, the Rapa Nui believed that these ancestors could watch over the living, protect the community, and provide guidance. Imagine having a giant stone relative who silently critiques your gardening skills, but also keeps you safe from danger. It's equal parts eerie and comforting. There's also a social aspect to the moai. Building a giant statue was no small feat. It required manpower, planning, and skill. The larger the moai, the more prestige the clan had. It was basically a giant flex, like saying, "Look at us. We honor our ancestors. And yes, we can also move a 40-ton rock across the island." And yes, some moai weighed over 80 tons, which is roughly the same as 10 elephants stacked together. And that's not counting the occasional stubborn goat that might wander into the construction site. Carving the moai was an art form in itself. The Rapa Nui quarried the stone from a volcanic crater called Reino Raraku, which is basically a giant natural workshop. Imagine a volcano that doubles as a giant sculpting studio, nature doing half the job for you. The sculptors used basalt picks and coral tools to carve the figures directly from the rock. They started with rough outlines, then gradually refined the details. The noses, lips, elongated ears, and the distinctive deep-set eyes. Some even had top knots carved separately, called pakeo, which were made from red volcanic stone and placed on the statues' heads. It was basically a giant hair accessory. Now here's where things get really impressive. After carving, the moai had to be transported to their final locations, often miles away. And there were no cranes, no trucks, not even a forklift. How did they do it? Scholars debate the methods, but the most widely accepted idea is that the Rapa Nui walked the statues upright using ropes, rocking them slowly from side to side, almost like a giant stone dance. Imagine trying to get an 80-ton rock to do the cha-cha across uneven terrain, and you'll start to appreciate their skill. The process of moving a moai was not just physical. It required teamwork, coordination, and probably a few heated arguments about whether left foot, right foot applied to rocks too. Entire clans worked together, sometimes for years, to transport a single statue. And when they finally set it on an Ahu, the feeling must have been incredible. A mix of pride, relief, and maybe slight dizziness from staring at something so massive. The placement of Moai was also deliberate. They usually face inland, toward the villages, symbolizing the ancestors' watchful eyes over the people. Only a few face the ocean, possibly as guardians or markers. Each Moai tells a story, not just through its facial features, but through its size, posture, and location. Bigger Moai signified powerful leaders or important ancestors, while smaller ones might represent everyday figures or early experiments in sculpture. There's humor hidden in the history, too. Some Moai toppled over, whether during construction or later on, and archaeologists now study these fallen giants to understand more about ancient techniques. Imagine the sculptor shaking his head, muttering, "I told you not to lean on that corner," while future historians marvel at the craftsmanship. And yes, there's still debate about whether moving them caused environmental strain, but that's a story for later chapters. Carving and transporting Moai wasn't just about art or religion. It was also a way to unite the community. Every stage, from quarrying to sculpting to moving, required cooperation. Each clan member had a role, and the success of the project reflected the strength and skill of the entire group. In a way, the Moai were both spiritual protectors and social glue, keeping society organized and focused on shared goals. The Moai also remind us of something remarkable about human ambition. These statues are massive, heavy, and difficult to make, yet people found a way. They found solutions, adapted techniques, and worked together. And they did it in a place as remote as Easter Island, with limited resources, far from the rest of the world. It's a lesson in creativity, determination, and the human desire to leave a mark, even if that mark is a giant stone head staring silently at future generations. Standing in front of a Moai today is surreal. You can feel the energy of the people who carved it, the countless hands that moved it, and the reverence that inspired it. Some statues are still partially buried, which makes you wonder how much more there is to discover. Others have toppled, but even lying down, they exude power. And all of them share that same mysterious aura, that silent gaze that seems to follow you, asking questions you can't answer. So, in summary, the Moai are more than statues. They are expressions of faith, skill, ambition, and community. They remind us that even in isolation, humans can create works of staggering complexity. They teach us about the Rapa Nui's connection to their ancestors, their respect for the land, and their ability to solve problems that would make modern engineers sweat. And just for fun, they also prove that humans have always had a flair for dramatic flair. The Moai are the ultimate combination of art, engineering, and spirituality. They are the silent watchers of Easter Island, keeping their eyes on the villages, on the ocean, and maybe even on us. And those centuries have passed, their gaze remains, reminding us of a time when humans dared to dream big, really big. In the end, the Moai are a story carved in stone, a story of ancestors, faith, ambition, and cooperation. They are the legacy of a society that wanted to be remembered, to watch over the living long after the people who built them are gone. And for anyone visiting Easter Island today, standing before a Moai is like meeting history face to face, silent, powerful, and somehow a little bit funny. Because honestly, who else can pull off looking serious while being a giant rock statue for hundreds of years? The golden age of Rapa Nui. If Easter Island had a glory days era, this chapter is it. We're talking about the golden age of Rapa Nui, a time when the island was buzzing with life, creativity, and probably a few people complaining about carrying too many giant rocks. By this time, society had matured. The clans were organized, chiefs held respect, and the Rapa Nui had mastered agriculture, fishing, and their unique culture. The population reached its peak. Estimates vary, but some scholars think tens of thousands of people lived here at once. For a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, that's a lot of people. And yet, they made it work. Somehow they fed themselves, celebrated life, and built a society that was thriving in isolation. The Moai were everywhere by now, standing proudly on their Ahu platforms. But life wasn't just about massive stone heads. People farmed carefully, fished the surrounding waters, and raised chickens. Sweet potatoes and taro were staples, and the fields were rotated to prevent the soil from wearing out. Imagine walking through a village and seeing neatly arranged plots of crops, smoke rising from cooking fires, and children playing while elders shared stories. It must have been a peaceful, almost magical scene. And life wasn't all work. The Rapa Nui knew how to celebrate. Rituals and festivals were central to their culture. Ceremonies honored ancestors, marked the seasons, or celebrated successful harvests. Some festivals involved singing, dancing, and even competitions, while others were solemn, meditative affairs designed to show respect to the gods and spirits. And sometimes, yes, these ceremonies probably included food. Lots of food. Because a good festival is nothing without a feast. Even if your buffet includes roasted sweet potatoes and chicken instead of pizza or cake. Music and dance were also key. Drums, chants, and body movements conveyed stories and emotions, connecting people to their past and to each other. These weren't just performances. They were living traditions, passed down through generations. Watching them today, you can still feel the rhythm of the island, the heartbeat of a culture in full bloom. Art flourished during this period too. Carvers worked not only on Moai but also on smaller sculptures, tools, and everyday objects. Patterns and designs appeared on wood, stone, and even in body adornment. Creativity was everywhere, and the Rapa Nui were proud of it. Imagine walking past a workshop and seeing people carving, painting, and experimenting, all with volcanic rock, bones, and shells as their tools. They didn't have Instagram likes, but they had community pride, and that was more than enough. The Golden Age was also a time of cooperation and ingenuity. Moving Moai became more sophisticated. The largest statues were carved and transported successfully, showcasing the society's engineering skill. It wasn't easy, but teamwork made it possible. Every clan had a role, every hand mattered, and each completed statue became a symbol of collective effort. You'd almost say it was like a massive construction project meets art class meets a spiritual mission, all rolled into one giant stone adventure. One interesting aspect of this era was the Burman cult, or Tangata Manu. This ritual took place on the nearby islet of Motu Nui and involved competitions to collect the first egg of a sacred seabird. The winner gained prestige and influence for the year. Imagine cliff diving, swimming through shark-infested waters, and racing across rocks for an egg, all for honor and leadership. It's extreme sports, Rapa Nui style. And while it sounds dangerous, and it reinforced social bonds, showed bravery, and kept spiritual traditions alive. Daily life during the Golden Age balanced work, spirituality, and social interaction. Villagers knew their place in society, but everyone contributed. Elders shared wisdom, young people learned skills, and everyone participated in the cycles of life, planting, harvesting, worship, building. And while there were challenges, like storms or occasional shortages, the island was largely thriving. Economically, the Golden Age was sustainable. People managed resources carefully. Forests still covered parts of the island, fish were abundant, and agricultural techniques were smart. The society had learned from early mistakes, and for a while, it seemed like the island could support life indefinitely. It was a rare example of humans coexisting with nature in a delicate balance, and the Rapa Nui were experts at it. Socially, there was a sense of identity and pride. Each clan knew its history. The Moai told the story of ancestors, and rituals connected everyone to the spiritual world. The chiefs led with authority, but their power was based on respect and tradition, not fear. People understood their roles, worked together, and celebrated life in all its forms. Even with all this harmony, there was energy, excitement, and maybe a little competition. Bigger Moai, better carvings, successful harvests, victorious rituals. Everyone wanted to contribute and be remembered. Life on Easter Island during the Golden Age was dynamic, ambitious, and full of creativity. And humor wasn't lost either. Imagine villagers teasing each other while carving Moai, joking about whose statue looked angrier or taller. Or children running around, imitating elders performing rituals with exaggerated gestures. Life had a rhythm, a sense of joy, and a sense of pride that kept the society vibrant. The Golden Age reminds us that Easter Island wasn't just a remote speck with big stone heads. It was a microcosm of Polynesian civilization. Agriculture, religion, social organization, art, and engineering all came together to create a thriving society. For centuries, the Rapa Nui managed to balance growth, spirituality, and sustainability, creating a world that was both impressive and functional. So when you look at the Moai today, remember they're more than silent watchers. They are symbols of a society at its peak, a people who carved, built, danced, celebrated, and lived in a delicate harmony with their environment. They watched over villages bustling with life, over rituals full of music and laughter, and over festivals where the community came together in pride and joy. The Golden Age wasn't eternal. Challenges would arise, and the island would eventually face hard times. But in this moment, at the peak of its prosperity, Easter Island was a jewel in the Pacific, full of life, culture, and ambition. A tiny island, yes, but one that contained a universe of human experience, ingenuity, and spirit. And maybe that's the lesson of the Golden Age. Even in isolation, humans can create something incredible. They can build, celebrate, and thrive, leaving marks on the world that echo for centuries. Easter Island, during its peak, was more than survival. It was life in full bloom. Strains beneath the surface. For a while, Easter Island seemed like paradise. The Golden Age brought plenty of food, thriving villages, vibrant culture, and giant Moai keeping watch. But even paradise has cracks beneath the surface. And on a tiny, isolated island, those cracks can grow fast. One of the first signs of trouble was population growth. For centuries, the Rapa Nui had lived in balance with the land. The number of people matched the resources. But as communities prospered, more children were born, villages grew, and the need for food, wood, and space increased. It's the classic problem: more mouth, same island. Think of it like a pizza that suddenly has 20 people at the table instead of 10. You can try to make it work, but eventually someone's going to get a sad, tiny slice. As the population increased, competition among clans intensified. Before, clans cooperated for survival and shared some resources. But now, every patch of fertile soil and every fishing spot became precious. Chiefs wanted to show their power by building bigger Moai, claiming better land, or controlling more resources. Friendly rivalry sometimes turned into tense standoffs, and minor disputes over food or territory could escalate. Imagine two neighbors arguing over who gets to plant the yams near the stream. Now multiply that by hundreds of people and a lot more stakes. Meanwhile, the natural world that had been so generous began to feel the pressure. Deforestation started quietly at first. Trees were cut for building homes, carving Moai, making canoes, and for fuel. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. There were still forests, birds, and plenty of shade. But over decades, the trees disappeared faster than they could regrow. What was once a lush, green island started to look patchy in places, with barren hills and exposed soil. Losing trees had a domino effect. Without roots to hold the soil, erosion increased. Fields became harder to farm, and water retention decreased. Sweet potatoes and taro didn't grow as well in dry, exposed soil. And the birds? Many species started to vanish because their habitats were gone. The island that had once been abundant and lively was starting to strain under its own success. Food pressures also grew. Fishing could only go so far, and crop yields were threatened by deforested slopes. Chickens were still around, but they could only provide so many eggs and meat. The early balance between humans and nature was tipping. Villagers probably started noticing that certain areas weren't as fruitful as before. Imagine walking past a field that used to overflow with sweet potatoes, only to see it struggling to produce a handful. It's frustrating, and that frustration would eventually fuel competition between clans. There's also a psychological side to this strain. When resources start running low, tensions rise. Chiefs felt pressure to maintain their status and control resources. Families worried about feeding children. And elders likely fretted about the future of the island, knowing that what worked for their grandparents might not work for them. Stress, anxiety, and conflict became part of everyday life, even in an island that had once felt peaceful and generous. And yet, the Rapa Nui didn't just sit back. They tried to adapt. They experimented with farming techniques, planted in new areas, and organized labor to maximize resources. But there's only so much you can do on a small island. Nature imposes limits, and Easter Island's isolation meant there was no outside help, no imports, no safety net. It was a self-contained world, and the cracks were becoming visible. Cultural changes reflected these pressures too. Rituals and festivals, once joyful celebrations of abundance, may have become more competitive or politically charged. Moai construction continued, but now it wasn't just about honoring ancestors, it was also about showing strength and dominance over rival clans. Even the birdman competitions could have been influenced by rising tension, turning spiritual practice into a display of status and power. Despite all this, the early signs of ecological stress were subtle enough that life continued. Villagers still farmed, fished, carved, and built. They still honored ancestors and celebrated life. But underneath, there was a shift happening, one that would eventually have enormous consequences. Trees were vanishing, soils were weakening, competition was growing, and the delicate balance between humans and nature was beginning to collapse. There's a kind of tragic irony here. The very success of the Rapa Nui, their growing population, thriving culture, and impressive engineering, was putting pressure on the system that allowed that success in the first place. The golden age was ending, not with a sudden disaster, but slowly, like cracks forming in a statue over decades. And the Moai, silent watchers though they were, could only observe. They couldn't fix the soil, plant new trees, or negotiate peace between clans. Historians and archaeologists today can see these changes in the record. Pollen studies show that forests declined. Soil erosion increased. Some species of birds disappeared. Villages show signs of shifting agriculture. And yet, for the people living through it, life probably seemed manageable, if stressful. It's a reminder that civilizations don't collapse overnight. They often strain, adapt, and struggle quietly first, until a tipping point arrives. The story of Easter Island at this stage is not just about environmental change, it's about human behavior. How do people respond when resources are scarce? How do they balance cooperation with competition? How do spiritual beliefs, social structure, and survival instincts interact when pressure mounts? These questions were becoming urgent on Rapa Nui, and they would shape the next chapters of the island's story. By the end of this period, the signs were clear. The island was reaching its limits. Trees were gone, soil was eroding, clans were competing, and the balance between humans and nature was fraying. But the Rapa Nui didn't know this would lead to disaster. They were doing what humans have always done, trying to survive, protect their families, and honor their ancestors, while hoping that tomorrow would be as generous as yesterday. So standing on Easter Island now, it's easy to admire the Moai, the engineering, and the thriving villages of the past. But it's also a place of lessons about limits, balance, and the consequences of pushing nature too far. The island still whispers these lessons, and if we listen, we can hear the faint strains beneath the surface, the tension building quietly before the storm. Strains beneath the surface are subtle at first, easy to ignore, but they matter. On Rapa Nui, they were the first signs that paradise was fragile. The island's story, beautiful as it was about to enter a period of conflict, adaptation, and transformation, testing the resilience of its people in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The fall of the forests. Easter Island, at one time, was not just an island with giant stone heads. It was a green paradise. Tall palm trees swayed in the wind, forests covered hills, and birds filled the air with song. But paradise has a tipping point. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Rapa Nui began to push the island beyond its limits. One of the first signs of stress came from something simple: wood. Trees were everywhere at first, and people needed them for practical reasons. Canoes for fishing, tools for carving, supports for buildings, firewood for cooking. Trees were essential. And let's not forget moving them all. Those giant stone heads didn't walk themselves. Timber was used as rollers, sleds, and levers. Every project, no matter how ceremonial or spiritual, demanded wood. The forests were basically the Rapa Nui's hardware store, and they were shopping nonstop. Palm trees were the main victims. These weren't tiny trees you could snap with one hand. They were massive, tall, and strong, perfect for making canoes that could survive ocean voyages. But cutting them down came at a cost. For each tree felled, the island lost shade, wind protection, and soil stabilization. It's easy to see how one palm here and one there might be okay. But over decades, hundreds and then thousands of trees vanished. With the trees gone, the soil became exposed. Rain would wash the topsoil down slopes into the ocean. Crops didn't grow as well. Sweet potatoes and taro suffered. And without roots to hold the land together, erosion accelerated. It was like taking the foundation out of a house and expecting it to stay standing. Eventually, some areas that were once fertile and green became dry, rocky, and hard to farm. Animals suffered too. Birds that nested in the palm forests lost their homes. Some species disappeared entirely. Forest birds in particular had nowhere to go. The island's biodiversity, once rich and vibrant, began to decline. Plants and animals that had thrived for centuries suddenly faced scarcity. The ecosystem was unraveling, and humans were part of the cause. The fall of the forests also had indirect effects on society. Canoes became harder to build because fewer trees were available. Moving Moai became riskier without enough timber. And even daily life changed. People had to work harder for firewood, crops failed more often, and the balance between humans and nature, so carefully maintained during the early centuries, was tipping. There's a certain irony here. The same hands that carved the Moai, built homes, and organized villages were also contributing to the decline of the island's environment. It wasn't intentional cruelty or negligence. The Rapa Nui were doing what humans have always done: use resources to survive, thrive, and achieve ambitious goals. But on a small, isolated island, overuse has immediate consequences. Imagine walking through the island over decades. First, you see green everywhere. Then patches of brown appear. Hills that once held thick forests start looking sparse. Birds you heard as a child are quieter or gone. Rivers carry more sediment because the soil washes away. It's a subtle, creeping change, but one that eventually transforms the landscape. Even social structures felt the pressure. Clans began to compete more intensely over remaining resources. Fertile land, fishing spots, and remaining trees became valuable commodities. Tension grew, and while the Moai still stood as spiritual guardians, they couldn't stop arguments over food, land, or tools. Environmental stress was now intertwined with social stress, creating a feedback loop of scarcity and competition. One fascinating, if tragic, detail: archaeologists have found that the very trees used to carve Moai and build canoes also supported the ecosystem in ways the Rapa Nui might not have realized. When the palms disappeared, so did shade-loving plants, insects, and the habitats of various animals. It's a reminder that ecosystems are interconnected. Pull one thread, and the entire tapestry can start to unravel. By this point, Easter Island was no longer the lush green paradise of the first settlers. The fall of the forests was more than just a loss of trees. It marked the beginning of ecological collapse, which would affect every aspect of life. Agriculture became harder. Fishing was trickier because soil and sediment changes affected rivers and streams, and the islanders had to adjust to a harsher environment. Yet, humans are resourceful. The Rapa Nui adapted where they could. They tried new farming techniques, built stone gardens to protect crops, and continued rituals to honor ancestors. Life carried on, but it was harder, and the consequences of centuries of deforestation were becoming impossible to ignore. There's also a lesson in timing. The decline didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, creeping, almost invisible at first. People continued building Moai, celebrating festivals, and raising families. But every tree cut down, every patch of soil eroded, added up. By the time the scale of the problem was clear, options were limited. On an isolated island, there's nowhere else to go. No imports, no external trade, no outside forest to tap. You either adapt or pay the price. Standing on Easter Island today, it's easy to see remnants of this transformation. Sparse vegetation, eroded soil, and fewer trees tell the story of centuries of human activity. The Moai still gaze silently across the land, but they now watch over an island changed forever by the ambition, creativity, and eventual overuse of its inhabitants. In a way, the fall of the forest is both a cautionary tale and a testament. It shows what humans can achieve. They carved Moai, built villages, and created complex social structures, but also how fragile success can be when the environment is ignored or stretched too far. On Easter Island, the balance between prosperity and sustainability was tipping, setting the stage for the challenges that would follow in the next chapter. So, the trees are gone, the soil is worn, and the ecosystem is unraveling. The Rapa Nui still live, still farm, and still honor their ancestors. But beneath the surface, tension is rising, resources are scarcer, and the island's golden age is beginning to fade. The silent watchers, the Moai, stand as witnesses to this slow unraveling, reminding us that even paradise has limits. Rivalry and civil war. For centuries, Easter Island thrived. Villages worked together, Moai watched over the people, and the land provided food, wood, and water. But eventually, the balance cracked. Scarcity began to strain relationships, and harmony gave way to rivalry and conflict. What had once been cooperation slowly turned into competition, and then full-blown civil war. The first signs were subtle but symbolic. Topple Moai. Remember those giant stone heads that once stood proudly, guarding villages? Clans began to push them over. Why? partly as acts of defiance, partly to show dominance, and partly out of frustration. Imagine arguing with your neighbor over a field, and instead of exchanging words, you knock over their prized statue. That's basically what was happening, but on a massive scale. And yes, it probably caused a few bruised egos, or maybe even broken toes for anyone standing too close. Toppling a Moai wasn't easy. These statues weighed tons. Moving them took planning, strength, and coordination. So when a clan successfully knocked down a rival's Moai, it was more than just vandalism. It was a statement. It said, "We're stronger. We're mad." And yes, your ancestor is now lying flat on the ground. Symbolism was powerful, and nothing screamed messy neighbor feud like a fallen statue staring blankly at the village. As the Moai fell, social cohesion crumbled. Cooperation between clans diminished. Instead of working together for common goals like building Moai, farming, or managing resources, clans focused on defending themselves, claiming fertile land, and outmaneuvering rivals. Resources were scarce, and desperation grew. Food, timber, and farmland became sources of conflict rather than abundance. Warfare erupted. Battles on Easter Island were probably small-scale by modern standards, but for a tiny island, they were devastating. Villagers used spears, slings, and rocks. Clans attacked each other to seize land, fishing grounds, and whatever crops remained. No one was immune. Elders, farmers, even the occasional ambitious carver could find themselves in the middle of a skirmish. The collapse of unity was profound. What had once been a thriving society of cooperation now faced fragmentation. Instead of shared goals, each clan focused on survival. Fear, suspicion, and anger replaced trust. Imagine a close-knit village where everyone suddenly eyes their neighbor suspiciously, wondering if they'll steal the last sweet potato. That's basically what the Rapa Nui were living through, but amplified across an entire island. Interestingly, even in the chaos, culture didn't disappear entirely. People still honored ancestors, though rituals may have become less joyful and more tense, performed to protect their clan rather than celebrate abundance. Festivals and ceremonies likely continued, but the energy shifted. Instead of music and dancing for communal joy, rituals became statements of power, a mix of religion and intimidation. The destruction of Moai was both practical and symbolic. Without trees, moving new statues became almost impossible. So toppling an existing one sent a message without needing more wood. It was like a warning, we're strong and don't test us. And in a society where spiritual beliefs were central, knocking over an ancestor's statue was not just rebellion. It was shocking, dramatic, and probably terrifying for the rival clan. The Civil War also created long-term consequences for survival. Agriculture suffered because farmers were often pulled into battles. Fishing was interrupted by fear of raids. Villagers hoarded food and resources rather than sharing. And because the island was isolated, there was no external support, no imports, no chance to flee. People had to fight to survive, and every clan became trapped in a cycle of conflict and scarcity. The Rapa Nui had thrived for centuries by respecting the land and working together. Now, ecological stress and human rivalry created a perfect storm. Clans turned against each other, communities fractured, and desperation drove decisions that would have seemed unthinkable during the Golden Age. Social norms collapsed under the pressure, and trust vanished. There's also an irony here. The Moai, created to inspire unity and spiritual protection, became casualties of division. They were meant to remind the living of ancestors' guidance, but instead, they were pulled down, cracked, and sometimes destroyed. Statues that took years to carve were gone in a day, symbolizing the fall of social order. The Silent Watchers could no longer enforce harmony. They could only witness the chaos. Some historians suggest that this period saw not just physical destruction, but also the erosion of leadership. Chiefs who once commanded respect and maintained peace lost authority. Without cooperation, no one could organize large projects or protect resources. Decisions became reactive rather than strategic, further accelerating the collapse. Despite the destruction, life went on. Villagers still farmed, fished, and tried to protect their families. But survival took priority over art, spirituality, or communal prosperity. The society that had built impressive Moai, organized festivals, and balanced nature was now a shadow of its former self. Daily life was tense, uncertain, and dangerous. The Civil War also highlights a universal truth about human societies. Competition over scarce resources can destroy even the strongest social bonds. On a small, isolated island like Rapa Nui, there was no room for error. Every decision, every act of aggression or defense had consequences. Toppling statues wasn't just vandalism, it was a survival tactic. Fighting over land and food wasn't just ambition, it was necessity. And this combination of ecological pressure and human rivalry created a perfect storm that the island could barely withstand. By the end of this period, Easter Island had changed dramatically. Moai lay on the ground, forests were gone, fertile land was scarce, and the population was divided. The social fabric that had supported centuries of prosperity had torn. Clans no longer saw themselves as part of a larger society. They were competitors, defenders, and survivors. The island's golden age was over, replaced by conflict, desperation, and uncertainty. Standing on Easter Island today, you can still see the evidence. Fallen Moai, eroded fields, and barren hills tell a story of rivalry and civil war. It's a sobering reminder that human ingenuity and ambition are only as strong as the social and ecological systems that support them. When those systems fail, even the greatest achievements, like moving giant stone heads across the island, can't prevent decline. So, Chapter 8 is not just about war. It's about how a society responds to scarcity, stress, and human ambition. It's about the tipping point where cooperation turns to conflict and civilization begins to unravel. The Rapa Nui fought, struggled, and survived, but in doing so, they reshaped their island forever. The silent watchers, the Moai, continued to gaze across the land, witnessing the consequences of human rivalry and the collapse of unity, hunger, and survival. By the time Easter Island reached this stage, life had become harsh. The forests were gone, soil was eroded, and fertile land was scarce. Crops failed, fish were harder to catch, and the once thriving island struggled to feed its people. The Golden Age, with its feasts, festivals, and cooperative society, felt like a distant memory. Hunger spread like a shadow over villages, and survival became the daily obsession. Starvation was real. Sweet potatoes, taro, yams, and other staples grew poorly in eroded soil. Fields that once produced enough to feed entire clans now barely yielded enough for a handful of people. Chickens and birds were gone or dwindling. Fishing became unpredictable. Even water could be scarce in some areas, especially where deforestation had reduced rainfall retention. Families who had lived comfortably for generations now faced empty stomachs and sleepless nights. When food is scarce, social structures start to unravel. Clans that once worked together began hoarding whatever remained. Chiefs struggled to maintain order. Arguments over land, crops, and water became more frequent. Cooperation was replaced by suspicion. People who had once celebrated life together were now watching their neighbors closely, calculating how to survive another day. It's the kind of tension you don't see in history books, but is felt in every corner of a starving village. And then, the unthinkable began to appear: cannibalism. Yes, it's grim. But in extreme situations, desperate humans sometimes turn to desperate measures. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting that some Rapa Nui may have resorted to cannibalism during the worst periods of starvation. Bones show unusual marks, and oral traditions hint at fear and horror from those days. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't done lightly. It was a last resort, a survival tactic born from desperation, not cruelty. Imagine the psychological weight of living through that. Parents trying to feed children, neighbors watching each other with suspicion, elders worrying about the future, and a society that once prided itself on cooperation now forced into acts of extreme survival. It's a world where hunger dominates thought, where fear guides actions, and where the Moai, those silent watchers, stand as witnesses to the unraveling of civilization. Despite this grim reality, life went on. Villagers scavenged for any edible plants, roots, and sea creatures. They tried creative methods to grow crops in poor soil, sometimes using rock gardens or small irrigation systems. Every meal became a small victory. Every day survived was an achievement. Humans are remarkably adaptable, and even in desperate circumstances, people find ways to persist. Oral traditions played a crucial role during these years. Stories, chants, and songs preserve the memory of scarcity, conflict, and despair. Elders would warn younger generations through tales of famine, fallen Moai, and social collapse. These oral histories served both as cautionary tales and as a way to maintain identity. Even as society frayed, The culture, memory, and knowledge of the past were preserved in words and song. Imagine sitting around a fire, children listening with wide eyes, while elders recount the chaos that surrounded them. These stories were part warning, part teaching, and part survival mechanism. Interestingly, even in extreme famine, human creativity persisted. Carving smaller objects, maintaining ritual practices, and creating symbolic art continued where possible. It was a way to cling to culture and normalcy in a world dominated by hunger. The Rapa Nui didn't abandon their beliefs, but the rituals took on a different tone. Less celebration, more survival. Prayers to ancestors became pleas for food and protection, and festivals likely became somber reminders of what had been lost. Hunger and survival also reshaped social dynamics. Stronger individuals or clans sometimes dominated weaker ones to secure remaining resources. Leadership was challenged. Traditional hierarchies broke down. People had to rely on ingenuity, luck, and resilience rather than the old social structures that had once held the island together. Survival became personal as much as communal, and desperation could bring out both courage and cruelty. The collapse of unity made recovery even harder. Without cooperation, agriculture and fishing became less efficient. Every resource hoarded or stolen left someone else worse off. Conflict over scarce food intensified, adding layers of stress and danger. The island, which had supported a thriving population for centuries, now seemed to push back at its people. The Moai, still standing in their ahu, watched the human drama unfold with silent, eternal eyes. But there's a lesson in all of this. Even in despair, humans adapt. People found new food sources, scavenged creatively, and clung to culture and rituals for psychological survival. Oral traditions preserved memories and knowledge. Communities, even fractured, tried to survive together when possible. Hunger changed the society, but it didn't completely erase it. Humans are resilient, even under the most extreme pressure. By the end of this chapter in Easter Island's history, society was profoundly transformed. The forests were gone. Fertile land was diminished. Topple Moai testified to previous conflicts. Clans were divided. Starvation haunted daily life, and desperate measures became a reality. Yet the culture survived in stories, rituals, and memory. The islanders faced unimaginable hardship, but they endured. The story of hunger and survival is difficult to read, but it's also a testament to human resilience. It shows how quickly circumstances can shift, how environmental collapse and social stress interact, and how people respond when pushed to the limits. The Rapa Nui adapted, endured, and passed down lessons through oral traditions, stories of famine, fear, and survival that echoed long after the crisis ended. So, as we reflect on this chapter, it's a sobering reminder that even the most thriving societies can fall into chaos when resources run out. Yet, even in the darkest moments, humans find ways to survive, cling to culture, and tell their stories. On Easter Island, survival wasn't just about food. It was about memory, adaptation, and the will to persist against overwhelming odds. The Birdman cult. After centuries of Moai construction, ecological strain, and social upheaval, Easter Island society began to reinvent itself. The golden age was gone, the forests had fallen, and hunger and conflict had shaken the island to its core. But humans are stubbornly creative, and the Rapa Nui found a new way to organize society, honor the spiritual world, and survive in these difficult times. Enter the Birdman cult, or Tangata Manu, a ritual that would reshape the island's culture and identity. The Birdman cult was a radical shift from the old system of Moai worship. Instead of focusing on carved statues and ancestor veneration, the islanders now centered spiritual power on a yearly competition. The goal? To select a supreme leader for the year and connect directly with the spiritual world. This wasn't just ceremonial. It was political, social, and practical all at once. Leadership became tied to courage, endurance, and cunning rather than inherited power alone. At the heart of the cult was the competition to retrieve the first egg of the Manutera, a sacred seabird that nested on the tiny islet of Motu Nui, just off the main island. Each clan would choose a champion, often a strong young man, to race to the islet, swim across shark-filled waters, climb steep cliffs, and finally secure the prized egg. Winning the egg was no small feat. It symbolized not only spiritual favor, but also temporary political power. The champion's clan gained prestige, influence, and control for the next year. Basically, it was like extreme sports meets politics meets religion. The challenges were intense. The competitor had to jump from cliffs into the ocean, swim long distances, and navigate treacherous rocks while avoiding injuries or drowning. Some historians estimate that dozens of people tried and failed each year. The stakes were literally life and death. You didn't just get a crown, you risked your life. Imagine telling your friends, "Sure, I'll dive off that cliff, swim through sharks, and climb slippery rocks for leadership and spiritual points." And somehow someone always said yes. While the competition itself was brutal, it was also a societal reset. The Birdman ritual allowed clans to channel aggression and rivalry into a structured event rather than full-blown war. Instead of fighting over land or resources constantly, they competed through this ritual. It kept the social order intact in a new way. Even in collapse, society found mechanisms to survive, adapt, and maintain hierarchy. The Birdman leader, or Tangata Manu, was more than just a title holder. He had religious significance. Owning the first egg of the season connected him to the gods and ancestors, granting him spiritual authority. His clan, by extension, also benefited from divine favor. Rituals, ceremonies, and offerings reinforced this connection, ensuring that spirituality remained central, even as old traditions like Moai worship faded. There's also a psychological angle here. The Birdman competition gave hope, a sense of purpose, and a visible path to honor and power. In a society where hunger, deforestation, and social stress had dominated daily life, the ritual reminded people that skill, courage, and cleverness still mattered. It created heroes, stories, and oral traditions, vivid tales of daring feats that could be shared for generations. Imagine an elder telling a wide-eyed child about a champion who swam past sharks, scaled cliffs, and snatched the sacred egg, all while chanting prayers to the gods. Those stories kept the culture alive. Even humor survived, in subtle ways. Competitors probably grumbled, complained, and joked about each other while preparing for the race. Villagers might have teased a particularly clumsy or unlucky contender. The tension and danger didn't erase human quirks, and these moments of levity helped the community endure the hardships of the era. Humor was another survival tool, even in the shadow of collapse. The Birdman cult also reflected adaptation to ecological change. With forests gone, transporting Moai was harder, and old power structures tied to monumental statues weakened. The competition emphasized endurance, skill, and cunning rather than brute force or ancestral prestige. Society could reorganize around the available resources and new realities. It was a creative response to environmental and social collapse. The rituals themselves were elaborate. After the egg was secured, ceremonies on the main island reinforced the Tangata Manu's spiritual and political authority. Offerings were made, chants were sung, a community acknowledged the winner's status. These events strengthened social bonds, reminded people of shared beliefs, and allowed spiritual continuity even during hard times. It was a way to maintain identity and stability when so much else had changed. Interestingly, the Birdman cult highlights a theme of human resilience. Even when the forests were gone, the Moai toppled, and starvation threatened society, the Rapa Nui found ways to create meaning, organize hierarchy, and channel competition constructively. It shows that cultures can adapt creatively, and even collapse can inspire innovation rather than total despair. By observing the Tangata Manu ritual, historians and archaeologists gain insight into how the Rapa Nui coped with adversity. It wasn't just survival, it was reinvention. They shifted focus from monumental construction to competitive ritual. They transferred power from static symbols like Moai to dynamic contests that tested skill, courage, and luck. It was flexible, responsive, and surprisingly effective for maintaining social cohesion. The Birdman cult didn't eliminate hardship, of course. Hunger, ecological strain, and social tension persisted, but it provided structure, identity, and a shared goal. It allowed the Rapa Nui to survive centuries of environmental and social stress while preserving cultural continuity. And perhaps most importantly, it gave the islanders a story to tell, heroes to admire, and a framework for leadership that worked in the context of scarcity and collapse. Standing on Easter Island today, you can still see the cliffs of Motu Nui, the waves the competitors had to brave, and the rocks where heroes climbed to secure the sacred egg. The Birdman ritual reminds us that even in dire circumstances, humans can innovate culturally, spiritually, and socially. It shows that survival is not only about food or shelter, it's also about structure, meaning, and a sense of purpose. So, Chapter 10 is about adaptation. The Rapa Nui transitioned from Moai worship to the Birdman cult, channeling rivalry, courage, and spirituality into a yearly ritual. It was society reinventing itself amid collapse, finding new ways to survive, lead, and maintain culture. The sacred eggs, the daring competitors, and the ceremonies all tell a story of resilience, creativity, and human determination in the face of environmental and social challenges. The Birdman cult stands as a reminder that civilizations are not static. Even when old systems fail, humans find ways to reorganize, innovate, and preserve what matters. On Easter Island, amid scarcity, conflict, and ecological decline, the Rapa Nui didn't just survive. They reinvented the rules of the game. First European contact. It was the year 1722, and Easter Island was still recovering from centuries of ecological stress, social upheaval, and famine. Clans were rebuilding their communities. The Birdman cult had emerged as a new cultural focus, and people were doing their best to survive. Then, out of nowhere, Europeans arrived. The first recorded contact came from a Dutch expedition led by Jacob Roggeveen. Imagine being a Rapa Nui villager and seeing a massive wooden ship with white sails appear on the horizon. For centuries, the islanders had lived isolated in the middle of the Pacific. Suddenly, here were humans who looked different, spoke a strange language, and arrived in a floating house bigger than most village structures. It must have been shocking, confusing, and maybe a little scary. For the Dutch, the island was equally surprising, but in a different way. They saw an island full of toppled Moai, scattered villages, and a population much smaller than what historians now believe had once thrived there. The contrast between what they imagined, an exotic island paradise with proud stone statues, and what they actually saw must have been startling. Instead of lush forests, the landscape was patchy, with signs of deforestation and erosion. Instead of a large, organized population, they found people who were thinner, wary, and living under challenging conditions. Roggeveen and his crew wrote about what they saw in their journals. They described the Moai, the villages, and the customs they observed, but much of it was filtered through European assumptions. They expected to find a noble savage paradise, a thriving civilization untouched by hardship. What they found instead was a society that had endured environmental collapse, social tension, and food scarcity. The Dutch couldn't fully understand what had caused these conditions or how resilient the Rapa Nui still were. Misunderstandings were inevitable. The islanders had their own systems of communication, rituals, and social norms. Europeans had ships, cannons, and entirely foreign customs. Simple interactions could quickly become confusing. Trade, gestures, and even attempts at conversation were often misinterpreted. One example might be a Dutch sailor offering something to a villager, only for the gesture to be ignored or seen as an insult. Communication across cultures without a shared language is tricky even today. Back then, it was a recipe for awkwardness and minor tension. Despite the misunderstandings, some mutual curiosity existed. The Rapa Nui were fascinated by the ships, the clothing, and the strange tools Europeans carried. They probably asked questions, watched carefully, and tried to make sense of the newcomers. The Dutch, for their part, marveled at the massive stone heads, the carvings, and the ingenuity of a society that had achieved so much with limited resources. Both sides were learning, interpreting, and reacting based on what they already knew or thought they knew. The first contact also highlighted cultural resilience. Despite centuries of hardship, the Rapa Nui maintained rituals, oral traditions, and social structures. They continued their birdman competitions, farmed where they could, and preserved spiritual practices. The Europeans didn't arrive at a blank canvas. They arrived at a society that had survived collapse, adapted to scarcity, and found ways to maintain identity and culture in the face of extreme challenges. There's also a subtle irony here. The Dutch expedition arrived expecting a mysterious, untouched society, but what they saw was the result of human resilience and adaptation. The toppled Moai and sparse forests looked like failure to outsiders, but to the Rapa Nui, it was survival in action. They had endured famine, civil conflict, and environmental collapse, and were still alive, still organizing, still living with purpose. That's not failure, it's tenacity. Yet first contact also marked the beginning of a new era. Europeans brought more than curiosity. They brought ideas, goods, and eventually diseases that the Rapa Nui had never encountered. Even small interactions carried long-term consequences. Seeds of cultural change, disruption, and tragedy were planted the moment these ships anchored and Europeans stepped ashore. For now, though, the encounter was mostly observation and cautious interaction. It was curiosity meeting curiosity, filtered through layers of misunderstanding, surprise, and cautious politeness. For the Rapa Nui, the arrival of the Dutch might have seemed like a minor curiosity compared to daily survival, but it was also a glimpse of the wider world. They had lived for centuries in isolation, thinking their island was all there was. Now suddenly, there were humans from distant lands, arriving in massive floating houses and speaking strange languages. It must have been bewildering, fascinating, and maybe even terrifying, like waking up and discovering the world is much bigger than you imagined. The first European contact is a pivotal chapter in Easter Island's history because it sets the stage for irreversible change. The Rapa Nui had survived isolation, environmental collapse, civil conflict, and famine. They had adapted, reinvented their society, and preserved culture through oral traditions and rituals. But now external forces, technology, foreign diseases, and new social pressures were entering the picture. The isolated bubble that had defined the island for centuries was about to be pierced. So, Chapter 11 isn't just about ships and sailors. It's about resilience meeting novelty, survival confronting curiosity, and isolation colliding with the wider world. The Rapa Nui didn't collapse overnight. They had survived crises before. But First Contact marked a new kind of challenge, one that combined the familiar struggles of scarcity and conflict with entirely new external pressures. The Dutch left their journals, the Moai remained standing or fallen, and the Rapa Nui continued their daily lives. But the island had changed forever. For outsiders, it was a remote, mysterious speck in the Pacific. For the people living there, it was a world already shaped by hardship, adaptation, and resilience, and now just a little bigger than before. Disease, slavery, and decline. By the early 19th century, Easter Island had already endured centuries of environmental stress, social upheaval, and famine. The forests were gone, Moai had toppled, clans had fought, and survival had become an art form. But new challenges were about to hit the island, ones the Rapa Nui could not prepare for. The first and most devastating was Peruvian slave raids. In the 1860s, ships from Peru arrived, ostensibly looking for laborers. Villagers were captured in large numbers and shipped across the ocean. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, and entire communities lost their most able-bodied members. It was like the island's population had been hit by a sudden, invisible storm, one you couldn't dig out from or rebuild from quickly. Imagine being a villager. You've survived famine, civil conflict, and environmental collapse, only to see strangers arrive and take your friends, neighbors, or even family. People were frightened, desperate, and powerless. Communities that had once prided themselves on resilience now faced a new, external threat that they couldn't fight with spears, strategy, or sheer will. The slave raids did more than reduce population numbers. They weakened social structures. Chiefs lost authority as their people were taken. Villages were left with fewer adults to farm, build, or protect resources. Rituals, ceremonies, and traditions suffered. The Birdman cult, Moai maintenance, and cultural practices, all of it became harder to sustain. The Rapa Nui had survived internal collapse before, but this was different. The problem came from beyond the horizon, from a world they had no control over. As if that weren't enough, the Europeans brought disease. Measles, smallpox, and other illnesses spread through the population. The Rapa Nui had no immunity to these foreign diseases, and mortality was high. People who survived famine, social upheaval, and civil conflict suddenly fell victim to invisible killers. Families were decimated, elders lost, and oral traditions, the very memory of past struggles, risked being erased. The combination of slavery and disease was catastrophic. Population estimates suggest that the island went from several thousand inhabitants to just a few hundred by the late 19th century. Villages were abandoned, fields overgrown, and once bustling communities reduced to fragments. It's hard to overstate how dramatic this decline was. A society that had built massive Moai, organized complex rituals, and survived environmental collapse was suddenly brought to the brink by forces beyond its control. Even in this tragic period, the Rapa Nui showed resilience and adaptation, albeit under unimaginable pressure. Survivors tried to maintain what they could: fishing, gardening, and performing rituals. The Birdman cult had faded, Moai maintenance had largely stopped, but people clung to family, memory, and identity. Life became smaller in scale, but not entirely defeated. Survival now meant finding food, avoiding disease, and keeping the community together, even if it was just a handful of people. There's a grim kind of irony here. For centuries, the The Rapa Nui had struggled against environmental collapse and social strife, yet they endured. Then outsiders arrived, not to fight, farm, or build Moai, but to exploit and introduce deadly diseases. In a sense, the final blows to the population were completely outside the control of the islanders. The very isolation that had once protected them now became a vulnerability. The cultural consequences were profound. Stories, rituals, and oral traditions were at risk of being lost. The Birdman rituals, which had once helped organize society during times of scarcity, largely disappeared. Moai were neglected, toppled statues decayed further, and the island's landscape slowly began to revert to scrub and grasslands. The material and spiritual achievements of centuries were still visible, but increasingly disconnected from a living, thriving society. Yet even in decline, hope and continuity persisted. Survivors maintained language, memories, and identity. They continued to honor ancestors in whatever ways they could. Oral histories preserved lessons from the past, tales of ingenuity, courage, and endurance. These stories would later allow descendants to reconnect with their heritage, rebuild cultural knowledge, and ensure that the Rapa Nui story didn't vanish entirely. The decline was also a cautionary tale about vulnerability. Environmental collapse, internal conflict, and scarcity had already weakened the island. But external pressures, slavery, and disease showed how even resilient societies could be devastated by forces beyond their control. It's a pattern repeated in history. Isolation can protect a society, but can also magnify the impact of sudden shocks. Standing on Easter Island today, the evidence of this period is sobering. Few people remain compared to the original populations. Moai stand as silent witnesses to a society that faced environmental collapse, social upheaval, and external exploitation. Fields once tilled lie overgrown. Villages are ruins. And yet, the descendants of the Rapa Nui continue, keeping language, culture, and memory alive. They are living proof of resilience in the face of near-total societal collapse. Chapter 12 reminds us that collapse is rarely caused by a single factor. On Easter Island, ecological stress, deforestation, civil conflict, and hunger had already weakened society. But the Peruvian slave raids and European-introduced diseases delivered blows that the population could not absorb. Survival became a struggle of numbers, not ingenuity. And yet, cultural identity and memory persisted, showing that human resilience is not only physical, but also psychological and cultural. So, this chapter is about decline, but it's also about endurance. Even when the population was reduced to a fraction of its former numbers, the Rapa Nui survived. Their culture, language, and stories endured, reminding us that while societies can collapse, human spirit and memory often persist. The island's history is a mixture of triumph, tragedy, and resilience, a story written not just in stone, but in the people who continue to carry it forward. Echoes of silence. By the late 19th century, Easter Island had changed more than anyone could have imagined. The forests were gone. Villages were scattered. The Moai, those iconic stone guardians that had once watched over thriving communities, now stood toppled, weathered, and lonely. The island, once alive with ritual, laughter, and the hum of daily life, had become a quiet shadow of its former glory. The Moai, in particular, tell the story better than any book. These enormous statues had once embodied spiritual power, clan prestige, and the connection between the living and their ancestors. Standing tall on their ahu, they were proud, commanding, and even a little intimidating. But over time, civil wars, neglect, and natural decay had caused many of them to fall face first into the soil. Some lay broken, their heads separated from their bodies. Others leaned precariously, like tired giants nodding off mid-guard. The once proud silent watchers were now silent witnesses to the collapse of the very society they had been created to protect. It's easy to imagine the effect on the Rapa Nui themselves. These statues weren't just art. They were central to cultural identity, spirituality, and social cohesion. To see them toppled must have been painful, constant reminder of a society in decline. They represented not just ancestors, but the order and balance that the island once enjoyed. Every fallen Moai was a symbol of how far things had shifted from the days of abundance, cooperation, and festivity. Oral traditions, too, were slipping away. Elders who had survived famine, civil conflict, and disease were dying. With each passing generation, knowledge of rituals, stories, and chants faded. Songs that once celebrated heroes of the Birdman cult, tales of Moai construction, and even practical survival knowledge risked disappearing. The memory of the island's golden ages existed only in the whispers of those who remained, and those whispers were growing faint. The decline in oral traditions was compounded by the island's shrinking population. Where once clans had rivaled each other, competed for leadership, and celebrated collectively, now only fragments of the community survived. Children grew up without access to the full stories of their ancestors. Knowledge that had been passed down for centuries about carving, navigation, rituals, and governance became patchy. Some details were remembered incorrectly. Some were lost entirely. It was as if the heartbeat of the island's culture was slowing, fading with each lost elder. Even daily life had changed dramatically. With fewer people, abandoned villages and overgrown gardens became common. Crops were planted on a smaller scale, often enough to survive but not enough to celebrate. The elaborate ceremonies of the Birdman cult, the festivals of Moai dedication, the shared rituals of farming and fishing, all became rarer, quieter, and more solemn. Life went on, but the energy and vibrancy of earlier centuries was gone. Yet the silence wasn't total. There were still people, still small communities trying to hold on to culture, memory, and survival. They fished, they gardened, they told stories. But everything was on a smaller scale. The island's former grandeur, the massive population, the soaring Moai, the thriving villages, was no longer part of daily experience. Instead, what remained were echoes, faint reminders of what had been. Nature, too, seemed to mourn. The eroded hills, sparse vegetation, and scattered trees gave the island a lonely, almost abandoned feeling. The once dense forests were long gone. Birds that had survived earlier collapse were fewer, and the ecosystem was fragile. The environment that had supported the Rapa Nui's ancestors was now struggling alongside the people. Life had adapted to scarcity, but it carried the scars of centuries of overuse, famine, and neglect. Even humor, once a natural part of village life, became rarer. Jokes and playful teasing were replaced by survival priorities. With fewer people and harsher conditions, every day carried weight. Yet small moments of levity persisted, perhaps a child teasing a sibling, or a villager quietly laughing at a minor mishap while fishing. These were small, human sparks in a world dominated by memory, loss, and silence. The Moai themselves, even fallen, still command attention. Tourists, archaeologists, and modern visitors marvel at their size and craftsmanship. But for the Rapa Nui of this period, the statues were more than art. They were reminders of what was lost. They were guardians whose watch had ended, symbols of the island's past strength and creativity, and silent witnesses to the fragility of civilization. Chapter 13 is a reflection, a pause in the narrative of Easter Island's history. It is about the quiet aftermath of centuries of human ingenuity, ambition, and struggle. It is about resilience and endurance, but also about loss. The Rapa Nui had survived environmental collapse, civil conflict, famine, slavery, and disease, yet the vibrancy of their society had dimmed. What remained was memory, oral history, and a profound connection to the past, however faint it had become. In this period, the island became a place of contemplation. Fewer people, toppled Moai, and fading traditions combined to create a landscape of echoes. It was a place where a past seemed to speak more loudly than the present. Every fallen statue, every overgrown garden, every fading story told the tale of a society that had achieved greatness, endured hardship, and now existed in quieter, humbler form. And yet, there is a subtle beauty in this silence. The Rapa Nui, who remained, carried forward the spirit of survival. They maintained identity, culture, and memory even under harsh conditions. They remembered the Moai, the Birdman rituals, and the stories of ancestors. They preserved the lessons of the past, ensuring that one day, future generations could reconnect with their heritage. So, Chapter 13 is about the echoes of what once was. The Moai lie fallen, elders pass away, and traditions fade. The island is a shadow of its former glory, quiet but still alive. It's a reminder that even when societies collapse, even when human achievement seems to crumble, traces remain, memories, stories, and enduring cultural identity. Easter Island is a place where silence speaks, and the echoes of its history continue to teach us about resilience, loss, and the passage of time. Lessons from Rapa Nui. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is famous for its massive stone statues, mysterious history, and the quiet, wind-swept landscapes that feel frozen in time. But beyond the intrigue of Moai and the bravery of the islanders, the real story lies in the lessons the island offers us. It's a cautionary tale about balance, resources, and what happens when civilizations push nature too far. Looking back, the story is clear. The Rapa Nui were ingenious, resilient, and creative. They carved hundreds of massive statues, navigated the open ocean to reach a tiny speck of the Pacific, and built a society capable of surviving for centuries on a small island. But the very successes that defined their civilization, building Moai, expanding agriculture, organizing rituals, and competing for prestige, also put stress on their environment. The forests, once dense with palm trees, were cut down to move statues, build canoes, and fuel daily life. Soil eroded, fresh water became harder to access, and biodiversity declined. The Rapa Nui adapted, innovated, and survived, but eventually the ecological limits of the island were reached. What had once supported a thriving society could no longer do so. Toppled Moai, dwindling villages, and famine were the visible consequences. This is where the first lesson emerges. Overuse and imbalance come with a price. Even a society as clever and resourceful as the Rapa Nui can exhaust its environment if growth and consumption outpace regeneration. They didn't fail because they lacked intelligence or skill. They failed because the natural system they depended on was fragile, and they pushed it too far. It's a reminder that no matter how advanced a society becomes, ignoring environmental limits is risky. The second lesson is about social cohesion and cooperation. Early Rapa Nui society thrived because clans worked together, shared resources, and maintained rituals that balanced spiritual and practical needs. But when scarcity hit, rivalry, civil war, and competition intensified. Toppling Moai, hoarding food, and conflicts over land all show that social strain often follows ecological stress. Even the strongest societies can fracture under pressure, and maintaining cooperation is just as important as managing resources. Another striking point is adaptation. When old systems failed, the Rapa Nui didn't simply give up. They created the Birdman cult, a new social and spiritual system that allowed competition and leadership to continue under scarcity. This shows that humans are creative and resilient. They find ways to adapt even under extreme pressure. But adaptation can only go so far. Without a stable environment to support population and culture, survival becomes a constant struggle rather than a thriving life. Looking at Rapa Nui today, we also see the impact of external forces. European contact brought diseases and slavery that decimated the population. The lessons here are stark. Societies may collapse from internal pressures, but external disruptions, like disease, colonization, or sudden resource extraction, can accelerate decline in ways that are hard to resist. Isolation may protect a society, but can also amplify vulnerability when sudden shocks arrive. And here's a modern twist. Rapa Nui is not just history. It's a mirror for our time. Today, humans face climate change, deforestation, overfishing, and resource depletion. The Rapa Nui story shows how fragile civilizations can be when nature is ignored. Islands and continents are different, but the principles are the same. Push your ecosystem too far, ignore limits, and social and economic systems can unravel. The collapse may not be sudden. It may take decades or centuries, but the pattern repeats. Humor aside, there's a bit of irony here too. The Rapa Nui carved Moai to honor ancestors and protect their society spiritually. They invested incredible effort into art, ceremony, and culture. Yet, despite all that creativity, their society was fragile in material terms. It's a reminder that achievements, monuments, and culture are amazing, but they rely on the foundation of a healthy environment and cooperative social structures. No amount of giant stone heads can save a civilization from ignoring ecological reality. The final lesson is about memory and adaptation for the future. Even after famine, conflict, disease, and population collapse, the Rapa Nui survived. Descendants maintained language, rituals, and identity. They preserved stories of struggle and ingenuity, ensuring that lessons weren't lost. History is not just about failure. It's about what we remember, what we learn, and how we apply that knowledge. The past teaches us about resilience, caution, and respect for limits. So, what can we take from Rapa Nui? First, respect your environment. It supports everything else: food, water, and social stability. Second, cooperation matters. Societies survive longer when people work together, especially under stress. Third, adaptability is powerful, but it has limits. And finally, history is a teacher. The echoes of toppled Moai, Birdman rituals, and oral traditions remind us that ignoring nature or overreaching can lead to collapse. Yet human creativity and culture can survive even after disaster, carrying lessons forward for the next generation. In the end, Easter Island is more than an archaeological curiosity. It's a story of ambition, ingenuity, struggle, and resilience. The Moai, silent and weathered, remind us that civilization is fragile, the environment is crucial, and cooperation and foresight are key. Their history echoes beyond a small Pacific island. It speaks to all of humanity. We are capable of incredible creativity, but we must respect the natural world that sustains us. And maybe, if you stand quietly on the island today, you can almost hear it. The whispers of ancient struggles, the laughter and tears of people who survived against the odds, and the lessons carved in stone and memory. Rapa Nui isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a mirror. It asks us to look at ourselves, our world, and the choices we make before the collapse becomes unavoidable. The island today, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, has come a long way since the days of toppled Moai, famine, civil wars, and European contact. Today, the island is alive again, though in a very different way. Modern life blends the echoes of history with the realities of a small, globalized community. The Rapa Nui people have rebuilt, revived culture, and found ways to share their story with the world. The modern Rapa Nui community is small, just a few thousand people, but vibrant. Families farm, fish, and live on an island that is at once isolated and connected. The elders still pass down stories, though now there are schools and efforts to teach children the Rapa Nui language and traditions. Oral histories that nearly vanished during population decline are being revived and recorded, ensuring that the lessons of the past remain alive. It's a reminder that culture is resilient, even when almost lost. Tourism plays a major role in today's island life. Visitors arrive from around the world, curious to see the Moai, explore archaeological sites, and experience the unique culture. Tourism brings jobs, money, and attention to preservation efforts, but it also comes with challenges. Balancing modern economic needs with the protection of fragile ecosystems and historical sites is an ongoing struggle. The Rapa Nui have learned from their history. You can't exploit resources endlessly without consequences. Even visitors must tread lightly to help the island thrive sustainably. Archaeology is another part of modern Rapa Nui. Researchers study the Moai ancient village sites and artifacts to learn more about the island's history, culture, and environmental past. Excavations reveal stories of ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation. Scientists collaborate with local communities to ensure that the work respects cultural beliefs. Modern archaeology isn't just about curiosity. It's also about helping the Rapa Nui reconnect with their heritage and share it with the world. The Moai remain the island's most famous symbols. Standing tall or sometimes leaning, depending on which survived, these statues are silent, timeless witnesses. They've watched generations rise and fall, seen ecological collapse, social strife, and the arrival of foreigners. Today, they still watch over the island, now alongside modern life, reminding visitors and residents alike of human creativity, ambition, and fragility. Many of the Moai have been restored, standing upright again on their ahu. The process is careful, respectful, and sometimes painstakingly slow. But the result is remarkable. Statues that once toppled under the weight of human conflict and environmental stress now stand as symbols of resilience. They are reminders that civilizations can recover, or at least preserve memory, even after near collapse. Cultural revival is happening in other ways too. Festivals, dances, and traditional rituals are being celebrated again, sometimes in modernized forms. The Birdman traditions may not dominate society like they once did, but aspects of the rituals are remembered and honored. Children learn songs, dances, and stories from elders, keeping identity alive. Even in a small, modern community, the echoes of the past find ways to live on. Sustainability is a major focus today. Rapa Nui faces modern ecological challenges, invasive species, soil degradation, and the pressures of tourism. But the community is actively engaged in protecting and preserving its natural and cultural heritage. Lessons from history, like the consequences of deforestation and overuse, inform modern practices. People plant trees, maintain gardens, and limit environmental impact, proving that the mistakes of the past can guide better decisions today. Visitors often remark on the feeling of history in the air. Walking among the Moai, seeing traditional villages, and listening to stories of past triumphs and tragedies can be humbling. The island is both a living community and a monument to human choices, showing the beauty, creativity, and vulnerability of civilization. Humor, music, and daily life continue alongside this deep connection to history. Tourists might laugh at a quirky local story, watch a cultural performance, or share a meal with residents, blending curiosity with respect. Education and global connections also play a role. Young Rapa Nui attend schools, learn about global issues, and study archaeology, tourism, and environmental science. They can apply lessons from their own history to challenges in the modern world. It's a fascinating combination: ancient Moai, centuries-old oral traditions, and modern education all coexisting on a tiny Pacific island. And yet, even with modernization, the core message of Rapa Nui remains clear. The island's history, from Moai construction to famine, from Birdman rituals to European contact, is a story of human ambition, resilience, and fragility. The past informs the present. The Moai watch silently, reminding everyone that our choices matter, that ecosystems are precious, and that culture and identity are worth preserving. In many ways, Easter Island today is a bridge between worlds, ancient and modern, fragile and resilient, human and natural. The people who live there maintain traditions, honor ancestors, and adapt to modern life while preserving history. The Moai, toppled or restored, remind us of human creativity and the consequences of our actions. The island tells us that while civilizations can collapse, memory, culture, and identity can survive and even thrive in new forms. So, Chapter 15 is a story of survival, revival, and continuity. The Rapa Nui people, their descendants, and their culture continue to thrive on a small Pacific island. The Moai, still watching, are symbols of both caution and inspiration. Tourism, archaeology, and cultural revival bring life to the island, while lessons from history guide sustainable choices. Rapa Nui today is proof that even after centuries of hardship, human communities can recover, adapt, and preserve memory. Standing on Easter Island now, it's easy to feel the weight of history and the pulse of modern life at the same time. The Moai look out over villages, gardens, and schools. Children play where elders once told stories of survival. Visitors walk quietly among ancient stones, imagining the past. The island hums with life, respect, and a deep connection to what came before. It's a reminder that history is not only something we study, it's something we live with, learn from, and carry forward. Easter Island today is both a cautionary tale and a celebration. It shows the fragility of civilization, the consequences of overuse and conflict, and the resilience of human culture. And most importantly, it reminds us that while history is written in stone, it is carried by people, by those who survive, adapt, and honor the lessons of past.